I'm Michael Freudenberg. This is Film Masters. We are into part 7 of building the Apprehension engine. What we're going to be doing is focusing on the bearing today, getting the bearing in, getting the side together and get that glued to the base so that we can actually start to see the shape of our Apprehension engine come together. So one thing you'll need to do is focus on today is think about what type of shaft you want to use for your hurdy-gurdy. Now the shaft is where the handle for the crank goes into the actual wheel itself. Is it going to be wood or is it going to be metal? Now I'm going to be using metal for mine. I'm going to use a threaded piece of rod. I'll go through the measurements of that. Now the reason I'm doing that is obviously so I can adjust the actual wheel when I've got it in place. However, if you're not very competent with metal, we can still go ahead and make a wooden version where we'll use a wooden dowel as a shaft, but make sure that the measurements for the bearing are the right ones. So get your wooden dowel and make sure it fits and has not too tight, still has the ability to rotate without squeaking and so forth. So that's something to take into consideration when we're building this. If not, just follow what I'm doing and you should be fine. So let's get straight into this tutorial. So in this tutorial, we'll be making a bearing from scratch for our hurdy-gurdy crank, and we'll also finish the framing. So that's just an example I created. Now I'm using a threaded rod. Now it's 5/16 thread and 5/16 threaded nuts as well. We'll also use some washers and so forth. Now this is just one example. What I am using obviously will be inserted into a aluminium rod, hollow tube. Now you can get these at your local hardware. What I did is I walked around the hardware with my, threaded rod and checked the clearance. Now that was nice and tight. And so another option as well is you can use a wooden dowel, and I will be showing you both these options. So you just need to choose which one you want to use. I found obviously the wooden dowel seems to be more smoother, and so if you wanted to use the wooden option and using a wooden dowel, then that is okay. Now we'll get straight into aligning our hurdy-gurdy wheel in the right hand side of the Apprehension engine. Now I'm using the same type of wood that I used to make the frame, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to try and work out where the clearance is going to be on the hurdy-gurdy wheel. So I don't want it to touch anything on the front frame, and what I'm going to do is I just want to make sure as well as that the hurdy-gurdy wheel is going to be as high as possible, but not too high obviously. The higher it goes, the less surface we have on our soundboard when we create it. I'm just going to use a nail, and I'm putting a hole where I'm happy with the height of the hurdy-gurdy wheel. And that's what you'll be doing as well. So setting it up and just aligning it. So we're not actually fitting it to the frame as of yet. It's just working out the clearance. Now, depending on the size of your hurdy-gurdy wheel, if it's a bit smaller or slightly larger, that's why I'm not giving you any measurements. This is something you're going to have to work out yourself. So once you've got the right clearance that you're happy with, then just flip the frame over. Make sure that you push the wooden piece as high up as possible and draw a line like so using the base. And that's going to give us the perfect measurement. So even if you're at a couple of millimeters, this is actually going to be perfect for your build, funny enough. So there's no actual measurement in this other than using the actual measurement of the frame that you've created. And we're going to use 2 of them. So I didn't show you me cutting that, and that's okay because I've showed you how to cut wood before in previous tutorials. And we're going to make a second one because we need 2 of these. And the reason we want 2 of them is because we're going to line them up and drill them. So I'm going to cut that second piece now. And with a bit of movie magic, there it is, all done. So we've got the 2 parts now cut, and as you can see, they line up perfectly. And what we're looking for is to make sure that the bottoms line up with the base of the side. So we want to make sure it's identical. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to duplicate the hole by simply lining up the 2 blocks of wood. I'm going to use a clamp. I've got a heavy duty clamp, which you can buy from your local hardware store. If you don't have one, use a G clamp or anything else you can use to clamp it. There's obviously different types of clamps out there. And what you want to do is make sure that the pieces of wood do line up before you drill. So I'm just making sure the base is all nice and lined up. Now to drill the correct circumference of the bearing or the tube that we're doing, I'm going to show you it really close up. This is how you get your drill bit, and you make sure it is going to be exactly the same size. So look through all the different drill bits that you have and make sure that it's not too big or not too small. I'm not going to show you how I put the drill into the drill bit, into the chuck. I'm just going to show you me using a drill press. Now, if you don't have a drill press, find someone who does, because you want to make sure it's nice and straight. If not, if you're competent with a hand drill and you're pretty certain you can get it nice and square, you can use a hand drill as well. So there we go. I've drilled straight through those two pieces of wood, and the holes do line up, obviously, because the two pieces of wood were clamped together. And so what we'll be doing now, I'm going to number them 1 and 2. And number 1 is the one that we're going to use and put against the frame and glue it. And what I want to do now is get my Hurdy Gurdy Wheel. And it is important to make sure that the hole in the middle of the Hurdy Gurdy Wheel lines up with the piece of wood underneath it, and also the clearance. See here, I'm moving it around and I'm trying to work out where I want this Hurdy Gurdy Wheel to be. And depending on the size of your Hurdy Gurdy Wheel, what you want to do is leave just a few millimeters from the front of the frame. And you also want to make sure it's got a good height, which obviously we've drilled it based on that. And once you've done that and you're happy with it, get a marker and just mark where the wood is. And this is going to help you when you're lining it up and hammering some nails into it and glue. So what we're going to do now, I'm just going to put a little mark in here. This is where I want this piece to be. And what we will do now, though, is we're going to make our bearings. So let's work out the length of it. Now, it's ideal to make sure that the bearing is slightly larger than the thickness of the piece of wood that you're using for the framing. Now, I am cutting it at 1.5 inches. Now, you can cut it around 1 inch if you want, that's fine. And the reason I did it at 1.5 inches is due to the fact is the longer the bearing is, the more it's going to have to be true and straight, and also helps to remove some of the wobble in the wheel. So 1.5 inches should be fine, and I'm going to need 2 of them. So this is a hacksaw. Hacksaw is going to be used. It cuts metal, not wood. You can use it for cutting wood, obviously, but it's designed for cutting metal. How it works is the blade itself is almost like shark teeth, and they bend backwards, almost like a tiger shark. And like this very rough drawing. And what happens is the teeth curve towards the handle. And what happens when you're dragging the saw towards yourself, that's when it's actually cutting, and when you're pushing away, it doesn't. So here's myself with it in a vise, and I'm just going to cut it. And it's almost like cutting hardwood. It's aluminium is obviously a soft metal, and you can cut it quite easily, as you can see. And we're going to need 2 of these, so I won't show you myself cutting these twice like I have in previous videos, but I'm going to show you that you just cut it and then just break it off. And then we're obviously going to need to clean it up because there's a bit of burr on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a file. Try and use a small file if you can. If you don't, you might be able to use some wet and dry sandpaper. There's another option. Just want to take the burrs off the edge of it, and this stops it from catching in the wood when I'm going to press it into that wooden part that we've created. Another thing I do as well, I'm going to use the threaded pipe that I have, or the threaded tube. And I'm going to allow that to remove the burr because it's actually got a thread on it, and the thread almost acts like a file, and it just takes off those little bits and pieces that are on the inside. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. Sort of like just push it in and out a few times, and you'll see little bits of flake coming out, and that will allow it to spin freely. So that's our first bearing done, so you need 2 of them. So I've laid part 1 down now, and we're going to insert our first bearing, and I'm just going to use a scrap piece of wood. You should have some laying around, and we're going to use that to push in our bearing into it. So just put a bit of pressure on the outside,
And we're going to use super glue. I'm just using a cheap super glue that you can get for a couple of dollars from your hardware store or shop. And we're going to put some super glue on the bearing, and then we're going to push it in fairly quickly so that it goes in and sets. Now I've pushed a little bit too hard there, so I just want to try and get that bearing in the center like this. And that should set fairly quickly because obviously super glue is quick, and that bearing is done, so you'll need 2 of those. And I'm going to put that part 1 with our bearing in into the side frame. Now, as you can see, I'm using the Hurdy Gurdy Wheel to make sure, again, that there is enough clearance on the side, and there is, so I'm happy with that. And so all we need to do is put some wood glue onto the back. I'll put some wood glue as well onto the very top, just to make sure that it sets nicely. And I'll also put some wood glue onto the actual frame as well, just to make sure that we've got enough there. And I'll just line it up, making sure that that part is very straight, because we do need to make sure that it is a straight part, because if it's too far off to the side, our wheel may touch and rub, and we don't want that. Now I'm going to use nails, the same nails that we've been using when we're building the frame, because they're the right thickness and size. And I'm just going to simply nail the first one in on the part at the very bottom. And I'm using my thumb to apply pressure. Now, ideally, I should have nailed this in somewhere where I didn't have so much stuff jumping around. Obviously, I didn't think of that. I just started filming. But another thing, when I started to nail this second nail in, I actually bent the head over on it. Now, there is a way that you can obviously dig that out if you're wanting it to be perfect. But because this part is actually not going to be seen, I don't think it really matters. So I'm just going to leave that. So it's entirely up to you, especially if you're going that rustic look. And we just need one more nail, so I'm going to put that right in the center and going to drive that through the side part, or part 1, where the bearing is, and that's going to lock it into place. And there it is, so that will set. And I'm just going to use an old rag, make sure it's slightly damp, obviously, because wood glue comes off nice and easily. So I've got an old Mr. Men or Mr. Muscle t-shirt that I'll be using just to remove that excess glue. So that part is nice and clean, and that part is now done. So one thing you want to do is making sure that your side frame does not have the bearing coming through all the way, and I'm using a pen just to make sure it's not, so it's not going to rub against the side paneling, which will be made of plywood. If it does, it would cause issues, so I'm just going to make sure that that's okay. And finally, we're going to glue this now. So this is going to bring our box together, and it's going to start to have that shape of the Apprehension engine. So this is something that I'm looking forward to. So I'm going to make sure there's glue all the way along the leading edge. So everything that touches onto the base plate of the Apprehension engine. So make sure there's enough glue on there. And then I'm going to use a G-clamp or a C-clamp or a D-clamp. It is called different names in different locations to make sure that it's nicely tight down. I'm also going to use some bulldog clips, the ones that we use the same on the other side to hold it down. Now what we want to do is make sure that the leading edge is in line with our base plate, because as I was saying before in the very first tutorial, when we made the base plate, it needs to be perfectly square, because if it's perfectly square, then obviously all the rest of it will come together. Now you'll see the frame is slightly not perfectly straight at the base, and that's why it's sitting up like it is at the moment. And that is okay, because as you can see, the G-clamp is going to bring it down and make sure that all those parts are nice and straight, which is exactly what we're after. And if it's not perfectly in line, which mine isn't at the moment, just reduce your G-clamp a little bit, and then just get a hammer, use either a rubber mallet or even just your wooden hammer, and just gently tap the side of the frame so it just comes in, and once it's perfectly straight, it's just a matter of just tightening that G-clamp down again. So here I am just gently tapping it in place so that it's in line with that plywood, and it is. So I'm happy with it, and that part is done. So this is what our Apprehension engine looks like at the moment. As you can see, the framing is nicely. So what we'll do is we'll cover in the next tutorial finishing the framing, because I want to make sure that box is going. And I've just sat my Hurdy Gurdy Wheel in, which we made in the previous tutorial. I'm just spinning it around. As you can see, there's no major wobble. So I'm very happy with that, and I hope you can get yours to this stage.
And that is part 7 of building the Apprehension engine. So we've got our bearing in now, we've got our side on glued. As you can see, it's starting to take shape. We'll be working on the framing next, so we'll be putting the frame together so that we can then start to skin it and then get the electronics into the actual Apprehension engine itself. If you have any questions, make sure that you leave a comment in the comment section below. I'm happy to answer that for you, especially if it's about the build. Anything to do with the Apprehension engine, just leave it in the comment section below. If you want to become a Filmmaster subby, it is pretty simple. You can subscribe to the channel. You can like me on Facebook and or on Twitter. And until next time, don't just film it, master it.